Good evening. My name is Savannah Tibbetts, and as the Vice President of Praxis, I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker tonight, Dr. Antony Davies. Dr. Davies is an Associate Professor of Economics at Duquesne University and a Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason. Dr. Davies earned his undergraduate degree in economics from St. Vincent College and his PhD from the State University of New York. His primary research interests include econometrics, public policy, and economic psychology. Dr. Davies has authored op-eds in over 30 newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal and the Los Angeles Times. He is also a regular columnist for U.S. News and the Pittsburgh Tribune Review. In addition to teaching at undergraduate, master's, and PhD levels, Dr. Davies lectures frequently at public policy conferences on Capitol Hill and state capitals. He is also featured in several Learn Liberty videos about balancing the budget and stimulus spending, which are located on learnliberty.org. Tonight, Dr. Davies will be talking about conventional wisdom versus the data in economics and how the myths touted by mainstream economists affect the economic climate today. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our guest tonight, Dr. Antony Davies.
So first I have to apologize for last week. In my opinion, there are two colleges in this country that understand what it is to educate students. Hillsdale is one and Grove City is the other. And Grove City is an hour from where I live. So when I got the call from Portia to do this talk, which was, I think, like back in September or October, I put it on my calendar. And time goes by, and round about December, I looked at my calendar and it said I'm supposed to give a talk at Hillsdale. I said, that can't be right, that's Grove City, and I changed it. So, last week I'm sitting around in my pajamas making slides at like 2 o'clock, figuring, Grove City's an hour away, it's no problem. And so I finished the slides, I opened the email to send it to Savannah, and it says, Savannah S. Tibbetts at hillsdale.edu. I thought, that's odd. Maybe this is some joint thing between Hillsdale and Grove City. So I sent it, and then I went back and looked up the email and said, holy crap. So, I apologize, I'm here now. So, this talk is conventional wisdom versus the data. So I'm just going to go through some things that people repeat and show you some data to counteract what people repeat. So one thing is that the government debt doesn't matter. So how much money does the federal government owe? We owe about $16.5 trillion. 2/3 of that is owed to foreign governments, to people. If your grandmother gives you like treasury bills for Christmas, like the Series E bonds, that's part of that, right? Money that the federal government owes. $16.5 trillion. Any of you ever been to Germany? If you went to Germany and you went to every store in every city and you bought everything that was for sale in the entire country of Germany, the total amount of money you spend will not be $16 trillion. If you went to Germany and France and you visited every store and in every store you bought everything, your total bill would not be $16 trillion. In fact, if you went to England, as long as you're there to go to those countries as well, and you buy everything in every store in every city, you wouldn't spend $16 trillion. In fact, you would have to go to every city and every store in the entirety of Europe and buy everything that is for sale to spend $16 trillion. That's how much the federal government owes. But there's more. Unfunded obligations. This is a separate animal the federal government owes. And the federal government separates out unfunded obligations because technically speaking, the federal government isn't obligated to pay these things. This is principally money, Social Security retirement, and Medicare health care that the government has promised to current and future retirees, which it does not have the money to pay. And that's after subtracting out the future payroll taxes that the federal government intends to pick up. So picture the federal government has made these promises going out into the future, and it's going to collect taxes to help pay for those promises going out to the future, and it doesn't have enough money to do that. What's the delta? The delta is the unfunded obligation, which is about $75 trillion. And that's, there are a number of estimates of this. This is hard to get your head around, right? There are a number of estimates of this. This is one of the more conservative estimates. I've seen estimates as high as $200 trillion. So debt plus unfunded obligations is $91.5 trillion. Let's put that in perspective. That is the economy of Greece at $300 billion. Greece, by the way, is about the size economically of Massachusetts. Right? Here's Germany, Japan, and Germany, China, and the U.S. at 15.6 or 15.7 trillion GDP. There's the federal debt outstanding. It's slightly over 100% of our GDP. There's the world GDP. If you want the ultimate shopping trip, buy everything on the planet. Your bill will be $72 trillion. And that is the total debt and unfunded obligations of the federal government. And just to be fair about this, because although the federal government owes that, it does bring in tax revenue, right? Which is that. And actually, the tax revenue the federal government brings in doesn't matter because it spends all of it plus more, and that's what you see there, the federal outlays. Okay, so what's the dangers of so much debt? One problem is it's way too easy for politicians to make much ado about nothing. A year, perhaps 2 years ago, this is February, 2 years ago, we spent, as a country, about 6 weeks talking about making $300 million in cuts in community block grants. So the president suggested this, look, we need to balance the budget, let's make $300 million cuts in community block grants. And other people say, no, that's horrible, these are the people who really need the money and this is going to be bad. And so we talk about this back and forth. For 6 weeks, $300 million cut to the budget will save the federal government enough money to fund itself for 45 minutes. It cost us more to talk about the problem than what the solution was worth. We talk about not going to Mars when there are people here on Earth that need help. Forget about Mars. Shut down the whole NASA, all of it. You will save enough money to fund the federal government for 48 hours. Second problem of so much debt. There's tremendous pressure on the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates low. So you hear this story about low interest rates are good because it makes it easier for homeowners to pay their mortgages and it stimulates the economy and all this kind of stuff. And in all that conversation, you're missing the one entity that benefits most from low interest rates. The federal government. The federal government is a massive borrower, and it borrows at market rates. The lower market rates are, the less interest the federal government pays. Currently, the federal government owes so much money that just a 1 percentage point increase in interest rates, just 1 percentage point, will cost the federal government on an annual basis as much as the Iraq and Afghanistan wars combined. The federal government will not allow the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates. But the Federal Reserve hasn't tried yet. But when they do try, the federal government will not allow it because it can't afford it. 3, we're quickly approaching a point of no return. So here are some numbers. I put these things together. The blue line is federal tax revenue. This is all sources, right? So any source of money the federal government has is here. The red line is interest expense, so interest on the debt. Now what I did here is I went back to 1970 and I asked the question, on average, how much does tax revenue grow? And it's grown since 1970 about 5.9% a year on average. Non-interest expense has grown about 6.7% on average. So if you put the figures together, you get this thing. So what you're seeing is currently interest on the debt eats about almost 20 cents of every dollar of tax revenue. So you pay $1 of tax revenue to the federal government. 80 cents of that goes to fund whatever it is the federal government does. 20 cents of that goes, 19 cents of that goes to pay for interest on the debt. If everything stays the way it is now, so we keep growing at the rate we've been growing on average since 1970, and interest rates remain at 2.6, which is what they are right now. 2.6% is what the federal government pays on average on its debt right now. If the interest the federal government pays on its debt remains at 2.6% indefinitely, then by 2050, interest expense will consume 40 cents out of every dollar of tax revenue. Now that's assuming that for the next 40 years, interest rates don't rise. Here you're looking at the average interest rate the federal government has paid on its debt going back to the 1960s. You see it's gone up, it's gone down, right? In the 1980s it was high, it comes back down again. The interest rate the federal government pays has averaged about 6% over this period. We're at a historically low point right now. Just 10 years ago, the federal government was paying 5% interest on its debt. Suppose interest rates, the interest that the federal government pays on its debt goes up to 5% again. That picture I just showed you will look like this. By 2046, the federal government will be bankrupt. 100% of tax revenues, interest expense will eat 100% of tax revenue. And I put a caveat here, the government will be bankrupt unless it defaults on the debt it owes Social Security. So if you recall, the debt the federal government has incurred, about 1/3 of it is money it's borrowed from Social Security. It could just repudiate that debt and say we're not paying it back. And in fact, the federal government there's a precedent for that. It did the equivalent of that back in the 1980s. Prior to 1982, Social Security benefits were not taxable. So if you got Social Security benefits, it's just Social Security benefits, right? You don't pay taxes on that. Starting about 1982, federal government instituted a law taxing for some people Social Security tax revenues, of course, Social Security benefits, and over time that has increased, right? So what the federal government is doing is effectively repudiating a portion of that debt, the Social Security obligations. Okay. So, those were my numbers I'm showing you. I'll show you now the official government numbers. This is from the Congressional Budget Office. So this is the entity that the White House uses when it says, okay, we're going to do X. And what effect is X going to have on the budget? They turn to the Congressional Budget Office, and the economists at the Congressional Budget Office do whatever magic they do, and they come back and they say, here's going to be the effect of doing whatever it is you want to do. Okay, so here's the interesting thing about the Congressional Budget Office. I've gone back to 1997, that's as far back as the data is readily available, and I've looked at all the forecasts the Congressional Budget Office has made. And it's made 121 forecasts since 1997. Of those, the Congressional Budget Office has underestimated the future federal debt 80% of the time. And if you look just at the forecasts that are for more than 5 years into the future, they're underestimating the future federal debt almost 95% of the time. Who cares? Well, if you look at their forecasts, we can figure out, on average, how far is the Congressional Budget Office off. What you're looking at here is their latest, came out February 2013, so last week. These forecasts came out. This is what the CBO is currently forecasting for the federal debt for the next 10 years. So you can see today's debt is 16 trillion something, and they're forecasting a debt of slightly over $25 trillion 10 years from now. Now, take these forecasts that they made last week and adjust them based on how far off CBO has been historically. So in other words, if these forecasts are as bad as the forecast they've made since 1997, here's what the world will actually look like. In 10 years from now, the federal debt will not be 25 trillion, it will be almost 50 trillion. All right, so how do we fix this? One piece of conventional wisdom is that we need to raise taxes, because raising taxes means more revenue for the federal government, and now we can pay off our debt. Here's an uninteresting graph. Right line just goes across there. You know what's really cool about this graph? The fact that it is uninteresting. What you're looking at here is federal tax revenue, right? So all sources of revenue into the federal government as a percentage of GDP. And what you see, it fluctuates, right? But on average, it's equal to about 18%. So over time, there's been some fluctuation, but it's also been pretty consistent. The federal government takes an 18% slice of the economic pie, and that's its tax revenue. Now here's where life gets very interesting. This is going back to 1954, right? Look at this. That's the top marginal income tax rate. So you talk about taxing the rich. That's the tax rate that we charge the rich, going back to 1954. So you can see back in 1954, the top marginal income tax rate was like 92%, and it drops down. You can see the Reagan years, and comes back up in George I and all of this stuff, right? Top marginal income tax rate. Now, conventional wisdom says, well, if you tax the rich more, you'll get more tax revenue. If you tax the rich less, you get less tax revenue. Well, look at this. Here are the years in which the tax rate on the rich was above the median. And we were collecting about 17% of the economy as tax revenue. Here in these years, where the tax rate is below the median, the government's collecting almost the same, a little bit more, 18% slice of the economic pie. The moral of this story is, it doesn't matter whether you tax the rich a lot or a little, you're still going to get an 18% slice of the economy. That's your tax revenue. This applies not just to the taxes on the rich. Look at this. This is the capital gains tax. So the capital gains tax, so for those of you that aren't familiar with this, this is you buy like stocks or bonds and you sell them later at a profit, and that profit is called a capital gain. You get taxed on that. Well, look at this. When the capital gains tax was particularly high, the government collected about 17% of the economy in GDP, in tax revenue. When the capital gains tax rate was low, the government's collecting about the same 17 to 18% of the economy as tax revenue. It didn't matter whether capital gains taxes were high or low. The federal government took the same slice of the economic pie. Here's the average effective corporate tax rate. Now this thing is cool because it's not the corporate tax rate, it's the effective corporate tax rate. What that means is, you have a tax rate in corporations. You know what it is now? Any of you accounting majors? I don't know what it is either. I think it's like 35% or something, right? But corporations don't really pay 35%. They have deductions and exemptions and write-offs and write-downs and all this nonsense that they do, right? They hire legions of lawyers and accountants to reduce their taxable income. What you're looking at here, this number comes from doing two things. It asks first, after you go through all the accounting gymnastics, how much do you owe in taxes? Second question, how much money did you make? One divided by the other is this. So this is the effective tax rate. It's the tax rate that the corporations are effectively paying after they do all their accounting gymnastics. And what you see is that it doesn't matter whether it's high or low, the federal government is collecting about the same 17 or 18% of the economic pie. All right, so you can argue here, this what we've been talking about is that, I can't go backwards, can I? No, it's not going to do that. We've been talking, now I can't make it go away, there we go. We've been talking about tax revenue per GDP, and that's kind of dodgy, right? Why don't we talk about straight up taxes? What happens to tax revenue as tax rates change? So what I'm going to do is show you this. I'll show you across here, this is going to be 1954, 2009. Nothing special about the years, it's just what's readily available, right? Oh, and I stopped at 2009 because I don't want to get into the Great Recession and all that stuff because it gets weird, right? So you're looking at the top marginal income tax rate, so the tax rate that we charge the rich. Up and down, I'm measuring tax revenue per person, right? So it's per capita, tax revenue per capita, and it's adjusted for inflation. And we'll look at it 1 year later, so we'll give some time for these new taxes to take effect. What we should see, what conventional wisdom would suggest, is that when you tax the rich more, your tax revenue should be higher. And when you tax the rich less, the tax revenue should be lower. Here's the actual data. It's the opposite direction. On average, when our top marginal income tax rate has been high, our tax revenue per person has been low. When we drop the top marginal income tax rate, there are exceptions, but on average, the tax revenue per person ends up being greater. This is adjusted for inflation. Here's the capital gains tax rate. Same kind of thing. It's not as cool of a picture as the other one, but there's still, on average, this downward sloping trend. And the funny thing is here, it doesn't matter. I mean, you can argue, well, that's not much of a downward sloping trend. It doesn't matter. The fact is, conventional wisdom says it should be going up, and is clearly not doing that. Here's effective corporate tax rates. Same kind of thing. This is cool. This is the tax rate on average Americans, the average marginal income tax rate. And what you see here is it's flat. Tax the middle class a lot, tax them a little, it doesn't matter. The tax revenue you get on a per person basis is about the same. All right, so the argument that I'm giving you here is twofold. We've said, look, there's this huge debt, we've got to do something about it. The second argument is, but the tendency is to say, well, raise taxes, and we're saying we can't raise taxes because nothing happens here. You get the same slice of the economic pie, or at worst, you're actually collecting less revenue. So what about this? Our problem really is that we're spending too much money. We need to cut defense or subsidies to whoever you... Who wants to cut something? What do you want to cut to balance the budget? What is something you don't like? Oh yes, you. Who are you?
Nathan.
Hi, Nathan.
Social Security.
You want to cut Social Security? You're going to throw your grandmother out in the street. Everybody's got something here, right? Because you talk about like the evil military, or you talk about the subsidies to oil companies or the pharmaceuticals or something. Everybody's got something. And they say, if only we cut that, we'd solve the problem. Here you're looking at the 2012 budget. This bar over here on the left is federal spending. So this kind of stuff, this orange brownish stuff down here, this is called mandatory spending. Here's how this works. This is spending that is going to occur unless Congress specifically takes action to stop it. The default here is that this spending occurs, mandatory spending. The blue stuff up there is called discretionary spending. That's the reverse. The default there is that spending does not happen unless Congress takes action. So the stuff at the bottom, entitlements, people get kind of bent out of shape when we call this entitlements, but we don't mean anything. There's no emotional content here. That's just what it's called, right? This is Social Security, Medicare benefits, interest on the debt. Other mandatory are things like veterans benefits, welfare programs, stuff like that. That's all mandatory spending. The stuff up above, the blue things are everything you normally think of when you think of government. You see defense there, right? We all know what that is. It's like ships and planes and bombs and stuff. Everything else, that's all those things like Department of Education, the Department of State, the Department of Agriculture, all of these things. That's all that. Dude on the right, that's federal tax revenue. Now here's the great reality check. You can cut out the entirety of the federal government, with the exception of Social Security, Medicare, interest on the debt, and you still won't balance the budget. You can reduce the federal government to the world's largest assisted living facility, and you still won't balance the budget. So all these little things about, well, if we just didn't build that aircraft carrier, if we just didn't subsidize the oil, just didn't do this, complete nonsense. You cannot do all of it, and you still haven't solved the problem. Okay, so how do we get here? What you're looking at is the average price level. So this is 1954 to 2010. And average prices have risen about 700% since 1954, right? So don't get bent out of shape about 700%, that's kind of reasonable. So what's going on here is if you have like standard 3% inflation a year, compound that over a bunch of years like that, you're going to get 700% increase in prices, right? So prices today, on average, are about 7 times what they were in 1954. Look at that. That's the per person cost of federal government. It's not the cost of federal government, it's the per person cost of federal government. It's risen 3,000% since 1954. Now here's the reality check. That is the cost of health care. It's only gone up 2,000%. We got completely bent out of shape about the cost of health care, so much so that we revamped an entire, what amounts to like, what, a quarter or a third or something of our economy, and let the government take it over so that we could constrain the rising cost of health care. This suggests we would have been better off having the physicians reform government than having government reform health care. Conventional wisdom. Taxing the rich will fix this problem. Oh, and by the way, the rich aren't paying their fair share. I looked up these numbers because people keep saying this, the rich aren't paying their fair share. And people said it enough, I thought there's got to be something wrong with it, right? People only seem to repeat things that are wrong for some reason. So I looked up this thing. This is from the Congressional Budget Office, right? Of course, these are people I just told you can't forecast, right? But they are pretty good at telling you things that exist right now. Look at this. The top 1%, if you're in the top 1% in the United States, the average top 1%er is making $1.8 million and is paying an average tax rate of 30%. That's an average tax rate. What does that mean? That means after you've done all the accounting shenanigans and the deductions and all that nonsense, you're paying about 30% of your income in taxes. And you can see it goes down as you get to the top. Oh, and by the way, this is all taxes. All federal taxes. So income tax, payroll taxes, Social Security, Medicare, all that stuff is there. You see the top 5%, the top 10%, it goes down and down. So look at this. Here are these dudes. The middle quintile, that's middle America, right? The average income, this is household. The average household income for a middle American is $64,500, and we're paying about 14% of our income in taxes. Half the rate that the rich are paying. Suppose the federal government received all of its tax revenue on January 1st and started spending. The top 1% of Americans will pay enough money to fund the government for 56 days. Almost through to the end of February. In fact, right about where we are now. The top 1% will have paid for federal government from New Year's until right about now. And then the money they paid runs out. And we go to the next, the 2 to the 5%. They'll pay for federal government through to the beginning of April. Then we're the top 5%, right? So the 5 to 10%, they pay through May. And here's the 10 to 20%, they pay through almost through the end of June. So what you're looking at here is we have made it almost half the year. Federal government has made it through almost 6 months, and made it almost 6 months on money that has been paid in by the top 20%. So the bottom 80% haven't paid anything yet, right? There's just the top 20%. Here's the 20 to 40% income bracket. They'll pay for 47 days. Here's the 40 to 60. These are the middle income Americans. They will pay for 24 days of federal spending. Now we get into the poor. Here's not the bottom 20%, but the next to the bottom 20%. They're going to pay for 10 days. What about the poorest 20%? Any idea how much they pay for? Yes. It's not zero, but it's pretty darn close. 18 hours. The bottom 20% pay. We've run out of people, right? This brings us to what I call deficit day. This is the day the money runs out. So this was as of last year. I haven't calculated for this year yet. As of last year, all the tax revenue that all these various people paid in runs out on September 9th. And September 10th is the day we begin charging. So everything from September 10th on through December 31st goes on the credit card. Who pays for that? Yes.
Future generations.
Sorry?
Future generations.
Yeah, your kids and your grandkids, they're going to pay for it. Children actually are the largest demographic here. Sorry, let's say it another way. Of all the days that are here, children are paying for most. In fact, they're paying for almost twice. No, they're paying for exactly twice what the top 1% are paying. 112 days. And you know what's very convenient about this from the federal government's perspective?
They can't speak up.
Yes, they can't vote. Taxation without representation is why we were founded. And look what we're doing. The demographic that pays for the largest chunk of federal spending cannot vote. The larger problem here, when we talk about taxing the rich, economists, so I'll give you my opinion as an economist, right? So you see like these guys, and these guys will get on the news and tell you, yes, they're not paying enough taxes and they should be taxed more. They're right. They can pay more. This guy is worth, do you know what he's worth? Do you know? He has made more money in interest in the time I've been talking than any of us in this room will ever make. Probably more than all of us will make combined, just in interest. He's worth about $50 billion or so, right? This dude. He can afford to pay another $1 billion. So can he. He's worth, I don't know what he's worth, but almost the same. They can both afford to pay $1 billion. As an economist, I don't care about them. They can afford to pay more. Who I care about are those two. This dude, this is Warren Buffett. I know that because Google told me. Right? This dude dropped out of Harvard to start a software company. That's a moronic thing to do. You don't drop out of Harvard, right? So why did he do this? He did it because he had a feeling that he could make a success of it and make lots of money, and he's not interested in creating jobs. Maybe he was. He doesn't need to be interested in creating jobs. All he has to be interested in is making a profit, right? And in the process of making a profit, he will create jobs, right? So all this stuff he's thinking about doing. That's on the plus side. On the minus side, it's, OMG, I'm dropping out of Harvard, right? And if it just doesn't work out, what happens, right? You're pumping gas or doing something. When we say to the country that the rich need to be taxed more, we look as voters at these guys. And I don't care about these guys. I worry a lot about those guys. Because somebody like him, if we were saying when he was in Harvard, the rich aren't paying their fair share, they need to be taxed more and more and more, it may not make a difference, but it's certainly going to make him think twice. And if you get lots of people like this, some of them are going to say, forget it. I'm going to stay in Harvard and get my law degree and do whatever it is I'm going to do. It's not worth the risk. If he hadn't, I don't know how many people he employs. He employs something like, I don't know what, 100,000 people globally. All those jobs, gone. Just from him responding to our statement that we need to tax the rich more. So as an economist, I'm very concerned about those two. Conventional wisdom. Look, we've got a debt problem. Raising taxes isn't going to work. Cutting spending, for God's sake, you've got to shut the whole damn thing down. Maybe what we need is stimulus spending. So the game with stimulus spending is you spend more, GDP grows, and you're only going to get 18% of GDP, but you're going to get 18% of a bigger pie, so now the government's very happy. You get lots of money. Whose idea is this?
Keynes.
Yeah, John Maynard Keynes. His idea is you spend more, the economy grows, and then I've already shown you that you get 18% of GDP, so you get 18% of the bigger pie. Now, it turns out, for good or ill, we have conducted the largest experiment in the history of humanity in stimulus spending. We spent, over the course of about 18 months, $356 billion on AIG and whoever these people are, GMC Group, this and that. The Federal Reserve turned around and pumped $1.5 trillion to bailing out banks and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Then there was the official stimulus package, which was money for bridges and roads and student loans and cash for clunkers. Then there was some miscellaneous money for financial incentives and housing incentives. Over the course of about 18 months, the federal government stimulus spent to the tune of $3 trillion. Right? Now, this is not standard government spending. This is on top of regular government spending. So the government in the background is doing all the things the government did before. That bar I showed you. Now we're going to do this as well. To put that in perspective, it's like taking two Canadas and stuffing them into the United States in the course of 18 months. And what happened? Our unemployment rate went up. The largest experiment in stimulus spending in human history, and it was a complete bomb. Now, you can argue convincingly that that was one experiment, right? Maybe we need to do this repeatedly. Maybe there was something weird going on. It was, wars in the Middle East or some, price of oil. I don't know what it was. Maybe there was something going on that caused this stimulus spending not to work as well as it would have otherwise. So what we need to do is look not just at this one instance, but all the instances in our history of stimulus spending. Okay. How does stimulus spending differ from spending? Do you know? Silence is the good answer. It doesn't. Stimulus spending is just, I mean, we put the name stimulus to it because we intend it to grow the economy, but it's just spending. It's not any different, it's just spending, right? I mean, it's more spending, but it's spending. All right, so here's what I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you, these are not the dots, this is just an example. I'm going to show you a dot for each quarter going back to 1954. Again, that's as far back as the data is readily available, right? Across the bottom, I'm going to measure change in federal spending as a fraction of GDP, right? So how much spending was going on. Up and down, real GDP growth. So how much economic growth was there? If stimulus spending worked, there'd be exceptions, surely, because there was all kinds of weird things going on, right? But if stimulus spending worked, on average, we should see a pattern like this. The dot should go up to the right. On average, as the federal spending rises, compared to the size of the economy should grow. On average, as federal spending contracts relative to the economy should shrink, right? So if stimulus spending worked, you should see data that looks like this. All right, you ready for the real data? There it is. There's no apparent relationship here. Certainly not enough of a relationship that I would feel comfortable putting $3 trillion on the line. Now you could argue, well, maybe stimulus spending requires time, right? Because you don't just spend money and all of a sudden things start growing. The money has to circulate through the economy and jobs create more jobs and her spending causes spending for somebody else, right? Okay, so let's give the government the benefit of the doubt. What we'll do here is we'll compare now changes in federal spending to economic growth 1 year later. And again, there's no apparent relationship here. And I'm not going to waste your time going through pictures, but I've looked at 2 years later, 3 years later, 4 years later, 5 years later, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years later. I stopped at 10. There's no relationship, no matter how far into the future you go. Another possible counter-argument is that stimulus spending is like a drug, right? There's some drugs, you take it once, it doesn't do anything for it. It's got to build up, right, in your system. Maybe stimulus spending needs to build up in the system. So if we have a little bit of spending, it doesn't do much. But if we have consistent spending, that does something. Okay, there's a way we can measure that. It's called a moving average. So what I'm going to show you next is, think of it as cumulative federal spending over the previous 4 quarters combined compared to cumulative economic growth over 4 quarters 1 year into the future. And for the first time, you will see a relationship between stimulus spending and economic growth. And it's negative. The only relationship I could find in this data set from tweaking it all many different ways, the only relationship I could find was this one, and it goes the opposite direction of what we're told. On average, as federal spending increased, cumulative federal spending increased, on average, cumulative economic growth declined. All right, conventional wisdom versus the data. First, conventional wisdom, government debt doesn't matter. The data suggests that debt really does matter. Debt's going to mean inflation, or higher taxes, or reduced government services, but it's going to mean those things happening tomorrow. And what's the big difference between today and, I say tomorrow metaphorically, what's the big difference between today and tomorrow as far as politicians are concerned? Yes?
Tomorrow's always someone else's problem.
Tomorrow's someone else's problem, right? If I'm a representative in Congress, tomorrow I'm going to be a senator. If I'm a senator, tomorrow I'm going to be president. If I'm president, tomorrow I'm going to be retired. It's somebody else's problem. So debt doesn't matter. Today's debt may not matter for today, but it matters very much for tomorrow. Second conventional wisdom, raising taxes will fix the problem. We use this phrase. We say the government needs to raise taxes. Actually, this is incorrect. The government can't raise taxes. It can only raise tax rates. Taxes are what you get when you combine the tax rate with people's behavior. So if your name is what? Annie. I need to raise some money to go home to buy gas, right? So I'm going to tax that chair that Annie's sitting in. I'm going to tax her $50 for sitting in this chair. What are you going to do?
Stand up.
Stand up. What happened? My tax rate is $50 for the chair. What's my tax revenue? Zero. The tax revenue is zero. The government can't control taxes. It can only control tax rates. Taxes are what you get when you combine the tax rates with people's behavior. And what do people tend to do in their behavior? They tend to avoid these things, right? So if you tell me you're going to tax my chair, I'm going to buy something. Do you know what a Jefferson window is? It's a beautiful example of avoiding taxes. Thomas Jefferson designed this thing, right? I've seen one in my life. It's a window that is like goes ceiling all the way to the floor, and you can open it, and it opens, and it opens all the way to your head, leaving an opening like this. Jefferson designed these things because why? Because the government was taxing doors. They would count how many doors in your house, and you'd be taxed on the basis of that. So if you put this, right? It's not a door, it's a window. People will respond to tax rates, and as a result, the taxes won't be as high as we think they will be otherwise. Conventional wisdom, cutting specific spending will fix the problem. Well, it turns out cutting basically anything isn't going to fix the problem. The only thing that's going to fix this problem is a complete overhaul of government. And by overhaul, I mean starting back from ground zero and asking a fundamental question. What is it the federal government is supposed to be doing? Asking that question is the only way to solve this problem. Taxing the rich will fix the problem. Actually, there aren't enough rich people to tax to fix the problem. You can balance the budget if you raise taxes on the 1% to 100%. You actually have tax on 100%. It comes out to approximately balancing the budget. What happens next year? Yes.
There are less people in 1%.
Yeah, what happens to 1%? They say, forget you, I'm moving somewhere else, right? I'm moving somewhere else, or I'm going to stop wasting my time and taking on the risk to do the things that made me rich. I'm going to just hang out. So your top 1% are gone. So now you got to tax the top 2%. Actually, you got to tax more than the top 2% because the top 2%, the 2% don't make as much money as the 1% did. So even if you tax them 100%, you're going to have to tax like the 2 and 3%, right? And then the next year, what happens? Those people say, forget it. Why am I taking on risk and working to earn all this money when the government's going to take 100% of it away? So they stop working. So now we're going to have to tax the top 5%. They're coming after you. Eventually, they get to you. The rich aren't paying their fair share. Actually, it's the poor and the middle class that aren't paying their fair share. Now, you can argue, and there's a good argument to be made, I think, from a moral perspective, that maybe the poor should not be paying as much of a percentage of their income as the rich do. I'm willing to entertain that argument. What I'm not willing to entertain is the argument that the rich aren't paying their fair share, when the percentage that they're paying is 2 or 3 times what the percentage is anybody else is paying. Stimulus spending will fix a problem. Yes, stimulus spending didn't cause a problem in the first place. Stimulus spending did you deeper into the hole. That's all I have. That's conventional wisdom and data. Do you have any questions? Yes, sir?
I'm kind of worried about how politics always enters the economics game and creates polemics and things like that. What do you think Paul Krugman's angle exactly is?
I have no idea. I can guess. It would be a guess. You probably guess the same thing. I don't know, because Krugman said a lot of things that are controversial, at least from an Austrian perspective. And he's done this for a while. But of late, he's started to say things that are just flat out wrong. I mean, from anybody's perspective. So I have no idea where the man's coming from. I will remind you of this, his Nobel Prize is not in the stuff he's talking about. The Nobel Prize is international. It's not my field, but I understand that he made some really cool contributions to that field. Yes, sir?
I think where he may be coming from is that he imagines more kind of a northern Western European economy where there's the value-added tax and some other kind of taxes that, in fact, considerably raise the percentage of income that is paid in taxes. So you look at some of those countries and, you know, I've seen that 18% average for the last 50 years or so. That's not the case in much of Europe.
Right.
And they're able to extract a lot more of tax revenues from their people. So don't you think that that's gonna have to be dealt with? That's gonna be proposed, and it's gonna be proposed as a solution to our problems, right?
Yeah, and I'd be willing to entertain an idea like that. Now, the reason the value-added tax is pulling in more money is because you can't get around it, right? I mean, the reason you're seeing that flat 18% is because when the federal government raises taxes, people alter their behavior to get around the thing. If you make a tax universal enough, people can't get around it, in like a VAT, for example. I'd be willing to think about that as a possible financial solution from a theoretical perspective. From a practical perspective, I think we're dead in the water, because practically speaking, every time the federal government has received more revenue, it hasn't used it to pay down the debt, it's actually used it to expand spending. So my supposition is what would happen if we did institute a VAT and the government got more tax revenue, it would just accelerate the problem rather than solving it. And that goes back to my earlier statement of the solution really is to rethink what should the federal government be doing. Yes, sir.
If we're not willing to cut $300 billion for community block grants, there's no solution. What's going to happen?
Oh, yeah. So, what's going to happen? And this is actually kind of fun because the solution's coming. It's not going to be political. It's going to be imposed by the laws of mathematics. They're going to hit a wall that they just cannot. You can't deal with it. The money just won't be there, period. Politically, I don't think there's any way, because what we've done is we've strayed so far from the Constitution that you now have all these special interest groups. And do you know the principle of concentrated benefit dispersed cost? Anybody not know that? Okay, cool. That's the problem. Concentrated benefit dispersed cost. You take that and you combine it with a government that's come unhinged from its Constitution. And what you have is this entity that's willing to put its fingers anywhere it wants. And because of the concentrated benefit dispersed cost, you've got a body of voters who are happy to have it do so, provided that when it does so, it's helping the particular voters. Yeah, I think politically there's no solution, is my guess. Yes, ma'am.
Is it not possible that the Federal Reserve will continue to print an astronomical rate and perhaps crash?
Is it possible what?
The Federal Reserve will continue to print at an astronomical rate and will crash the currency rather than have a debt reckoning?
Yeah, I think that's what we're going to see, is the Federal Reserve. And when I said earlier about the Federal Reserve is going to come under pressure not to raise interest rates, not raise interest rates means it's going to have to be printing money. And that's what you see with this quantitative easing. Did you wonder why it's called quantitative easing? This is a new term, right? Quantitative easing is not simply expanding the money supply, buying up, off the market. It's buying treasury bills directly from the government as opposed to buying them from the secondary market. That is what economists call monetizing debt. You're just printing, right? Yeah, that's where we're going. I did some years ago back of the envelope calculation. Don't quote me on this because I'm not a macroeconomist. But my back of the envelope calculation was just to close the deficit. So forget about paying off the debt. Just close that. You're talking like printing enough to create 15% sustained inflation. Yeah, I think that's where we're going to go. Now, this is all very depressing, right? It's not. It's not depressing, it's exciting. And particularly, it should be exciting for you all. For the first time in 200, maybe 150 years, you have the opportunity to take a firm hand in deciding where this country is going to go. Because we're going to have to start back at zero, in some sense. I think definitely politically, possibly economically. And the cool thing is, I mean, are we going to face some difficult times? Sure we are. You know, I think the Great Recession that we've been living through is not going to end. I think the next 10 years are going to look at best like the last 3 did. However, we'll reach a point where something's got to give. Got to give, I mean, by the laws of mathematics, it's going to give. One likely possibility in my mind is that the federal government devolves power to the states and says at some point, we can't continue. Social Security, Medicare, or if it's Obamacare by that time, the federal government cannot handle these expenses anymore. Therefore, you states handle them and do it any way you please. You want to have Social Security or some version of it or nothing at all, do what you want. And all of a sudden, you've got something really cool happening. You've got 50 experiments competing with each other for people and businesses. That's what we were designed to be. And that's the solution to the problem. Rather than having a political monopoly, have political competition. Some states will do it wrong, they'll screw it up. Some states will do it right. And the ones that screw it up will learn from the ones that do it right, just like businesses that screw up learn from businesses who do well. And that benefits everybody, benefits all the consumers. In this case, it benefits the electorate. So I'm not going to pussyfoot around it. We're going to have some tough times. But what comes out the other end is going to be a really cool country. It looks a lot more like we're supposed to look than we have looked for the past 75 years. Yes, sir.
Of course, if you look at economic meltdown in other countries in history, usually they came out worse, not better. And I'm thinking post-Weimar Germany, where you had Hitler elected, right? I mean, I think that's more likely outcome. Not to depress anybody here, but people will say, "Oh, we're so screwed. We need a great leader," and you're going to get a great leader, and God help us.
Yeah, you may, but again, I take great solace in the laws of mathematics are on our side here. The great leader is going to bump up against the fact that it's just not possible. It's mathematically impossible to sustain the federal government at the rate it's been sustained, no matter how charismatic a leader. And, Hitler, sure, you had the rise of Hitler, but long term, Germany ended up being what it is now. A really cool place. A lot better than it was then.
After being bombed to
Yeah,
time.
well, yeah. There's going to be some pain. I don't know that it's going to be that, right? So I'm not smart enough to know about the political side, but I'm just saying economically, we're going to go through some rough patch. And what we need, more than anything, are people like you we've got plenty of people who do stuff, right? Build things, all that. But what we're missing, and be careful because you're surrounded by these people and so your tendency is to think that all the world is this way. It's not. You are a very, very, very small percentage of the population and a very well-skilled one. You think about these things. You understand economics, you understand philosophy, you understand political theory. These are the things that are going to be necessary to recraft the country the way it's supposed to go. Part of the reason that we got such a cool constitution is because the people who crafted it were trained in exactly the things you're being trained in. That's what you need. People who can think very clearly and have some philosophical grounding.